Buy the mule, she comes with it. The trader's voice, slick with sweat and cheap whiskey, cut through the dust and the lowing of livestock. He grinned, showing teeth stained brown at the gums, and gestured with a fat thumb. Not at the mule, a fine, sturdy animal with patient eyes, but at the woman standing beside it, holding its lead rope. You think you know this story. You see the man in the worn hat, his face a map of sun and wind, stepping from the crowd. You hear the sharp intake of breath. You expect a hero, a rescue, a righteous fist connecting with a deserving jaw. But that's not what happened, not then. The truth of that day in the dusty yard was quieter, and it had less to do with saving someone and more to do with a debt that had come due. It was a choice, but not the one you think, and it changed everything. Stay a while, and you'll see how. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Jedediah Stone went to the auction in Three Creeks for a mule, nothing more. For 9 years, his life had been stripped down to what was necessary. The ranch was necessary. The horses were necessary. Work was necessary. Anything else was a complication he could not afford. Grief had a way of hollowing a man out, and Jed had filled the hollow space with labor, mistaking the exhaustion for peace. He called it simplification. He did not call it loneliness. The ranch was high country, a spread of bunch grass and stone nestled against the spine of the mountains. It was his and his alone, bought with the last of his army pay and the first of his hope. A place he and Mary had chosen together. She'd loved the way the light fell on the eastern ridge at dusk, turning the rock to bruised purple and old gold. She was buried on that ridge now, alongside the small, unmarked grave of the son who had followed her out of the world 9 days later, taken by the same winter fever that had stolen her breath. That was 9 years ago. 9 years, 3 months, and a handful of days. Jedediah counted. He counted everything. It was a way of keeping the world in its place. His life was a series of relentless, repeating tasks. He rose before the sun, the cold floorboards a familiar shock to his bare feet. He made coffee, strong and black. He checked the horses, his hands moving over their flanks and legs with an expert's touch, searching for heat or swelling. He mended fences the snows had brought down. He rode the long perimeter of his land, not for the view, but for the breaks in the wire, the signs of predators, the slow erosions of wind and water. His only human contact was a weekly ride into Three Creeks for supplies, a silent transaction with the storekeep, a nod to the smithy. He had 2 neighbors, the McAllisters, 10 miles south, but he hadn't seen them since the spring thaw. He had a reputation in the valley, a hard man, a quiet man. They mistook his carefulness for hardness. Jed did not correct them. His old mule, Balaam, had given up the ghost a week prior, lying down in the pasture with a sigh and simply refusing to get up again. Jed had sat with the animal all afternoon, his hand on its still warm neck until the sun went down. It was another loss, smaller than the first, but it echoed. A ranch needed a mule. So he'd cleaned himself up, putting on the town shirt he wore once a week, and rode his best gelding the 15 miles to the auction. He hated the auction yard, the noise, the smell of anxious animals and more anxious men, the slick pronouncements of the auctioneer that turned living flesh into columns of figures. He stood at the back, near the fence, content to watch and wait. He knew what he was looking for: strong back, good feet, a calm eye. He didn't need a fancy animal, just a worker, a thing that could be relied upon. Then the trader, a man named Finch who dealt in questionable stock and broken promises, brought out the gray mule. Jed's eyes took in the animal with professional appreciation. Good bone, deep chest, stood square, no older than 5, an honest animal. And then he saw the woman holding the rope. She was small, dressed in a plain brown skirt and a man's shirt, worn thin at the elbows. A dark braid fell over her shoulder. Her face was still, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the jeering crowd, beyond the dusty corral, beyond the whole sorry world. She did not flinch when Finch laid a hand on the mule's rump. She did not react when he started his pitch. It was as if she had built a wall of stillness around herself, a wall no sound could penetrate. Jed had seen that look before. He had seen it in the eyes of green soldiers after their first battle. He had seen it in his own reflection in the window glass on the 10th day, the day after he had buried his son. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and was now simply waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Finch worked the crowd, extolling the mule's virtues. Then his eyes landed on the woman again, and a low, cruel sort of cunning entered them. He saw an angle, an opportunity for a bit of sport. "And this fine beast," Finch bellowed, his voice oiled with false bonhomie, "comes from the far south, part of an estate settlement. Belonged to a fella took sick on the trail. This here is his daughter." He gestured to the woman. "Inez. Don't speak much English, but she's a hard worker, I'm told." A few men chuckled. A low murmur went through the crowd. It was an ugly thing what Finch was doing. He was blurring the line, turning the woman into just another piece of property to be disposed of. She was not on the bill of sale, not officially, but he was packaging her with the animal, a bonus for the prurient and the powerful. "So, what am I bid for this fine mule?" Finch cried. "Let's start at $40, a bargain at twice the price." The bidding was sluggish. The townspeople were decent folk for the most part, and Finch's stunt had left a bad taste in their mouths. The bids climbed slowly. 42, 43. Jed stayed silent, his jaw tight. He just wanted a mule. This was a complication. A debt can be a cage, or it can be a bridge. He remembered Silas, his old partner, saying that once, years ago, when they'd been trapped by an early blizzard. You just have to know which way to walk. The bidding stalled at $48, offered by a rancher from the low valley, known for working his hands and his animals into the ground. Finch was getting desperate. He looked around the yard, his eyes scanning for a bigger fish. That's when he laid it on thick. He slapped the mule's flank, making it jump. The woman, Inez, calmed it with a soft word Jed couldn't hear and a steady hand on its neck. "Come on, gentlemen," Finch yelled. $48 for an animal that will last you 20 years, and think of the bonus." He winked, a grotesque conspiratorial gesture. That was when he said it, the line that would hang in the air like smoke. "Buy the mule, she comes with it." The laughter that followed was louder this time, meaner. It was the laughter of men who saw weakness and wanted to prod it. The woman, Inez, did not move. Her back remained straight, her chin did not drop. But Jed saw the knuckles on the hand holding the rope go white. Jedediah Stone had spent 9 years avoiding complications. He had spent 9 years building a life that was quiet and orderly and empty. He looked at the mule's patient eyes. He looked at the woman's rigid stillness, and he thought of Silas. Silas, who had died 2 months ago, 1,000 miles away. Silas, whose last letter was sitting in a drawer back at the ranch, unread for a second time. Silas, who had a knack for getting into and out of trouble, and for seeing the simple, hard truth of a situation. The rancher who had bid $48 was starting to look pleased with himself, a greasy smile spreading across his face. He was already imagining the work he'd get out of both of them. Jed took a step forward, the dust puffed up around his worn boots. The yard fell quiet. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried in the sudden silence. It was rusty from disuse. $50, Jedediah said. Finch's head swiveled toward him, a flicker of surprise, then greedy recognition. $50 from Mr. Stone! Do I hear 51? The other rancher scowled, but he was a cheap man at heart. He shook his head. $50 once, $50 twice. Finch's eyes were gleaming. He had gotten his price, and his bit of drama besides. Sold to Jedediah Stone for $50. Jed walked forward, ignoring the eyes of the crowd. He did not look at Finch. He walked past him to the clerk's table and counted out the money in worn bills and heavy coins. He took the receipt. Then he walked back to the mule. He stopped in front of the woman, Inez. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, finally met his. They were not pleading. They were not grateful. They were just watching, assessing. Jedediah held out his hand, not for her, but for the rope. For a long second she didn't move. She held the lead as if it were the last solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid beneath her feet. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed the worn leather into his palm. Her fingers did not brush his. Finch, unable to leave well enough alone, swaggered over. "A fine piece of business, Stone. You got yourself a bargain." Jed turned his head slowly and looked at the trader. He didn't say a word. He just looked. He looked at him with the flat, patient gaze of a man who has sat with death and is not impressed by the petty cruelties of living men. He looked at him until the sweat on Finch's forehead began to bead and run, until the smirk slid from his face, until the trader took an involuntary step back as if Jed's silence were a physical force. The yard was so quiet you could hear the creak of the distant windmill. Every man there, the ranchers, the hands, the townsfolk, held their breath. They had expected a shout, a threat, a blow. They had seen men defend their honor with fists over lesser things. But Jedediah's reply was silence. A silence that was louder than any shout. A silence that stripped Finch of his power, that judged him and found him wanting, that dismissed him as utterly and completely irrelevant. Finally, Jed turned away from the trader. He gave a soft cluck of his tongue and a gentle tug on the lead rope. The mule followed him without hesitation. The woman, Inez, fell into step just behind his shoulder, her eyes once again fixed on that point in the middle distance. Jedediah Stone walked out of the auction yard, leaving the silence to curdle behind him, with a mule he had paid for and a woman who had come with it. The complication had begun. The ride back to the ranch was 15 miles of silence. Jed led the gelding, the new mule trailing behind, and the woman walked a few paces back, matching his stride without effort. The sun was hot, the dust thick. He offered her a ride on the gelding once, a gesture toward the mule indicating he could walk. She just shook her head, a single sharp motion. He didn't ask again. He watched her in the corner of his eye. She moved with an economy he recognized, the fluid grace of someone who has spent their life walking long distances and working hard. She wasn't winded. When they stopped to water the animals at a creek, she knelt on the bank, cupped her hands, and drank. She did not look at him. She did not speak. He was a fact in her landscape now, and she was observing him, measuring him, the way you'd measure a strange dog or a gathering storm. They reached the ranch as the sun was touching the western peaks, painting the rock in those colors Mary had loved. The place looked the same as always, the sturdy, unpainted cabin, the long corral, the barn with its scent of hay and horses. But seeing it with her a few paces behind him, it looked different, fuller somehow, and more empty at the same time. He led the animals into the corral, unsaddled the gelding, and turned the mule into a small pen with fresh water and hay. The woman stood by the fence, her hands clasped behind her back, watching, waiting for instructions. For the first time, a flicker of something, uncertainty maybe, crossed her face. This was the moment of arrival, the moment she would find out what sort of cage she had been sold into. Jed finished with the animals, rubbing down the gelding with a practiced motion. He hung the saddle on its rack. He could feel her stillness behind him. He took a breath. This was the part he hadn't thought through. He had acted on an impulse, a half-forgotten loyalty to a dead man. Now the consequence of that impulse was standing in his yard. He turned to her. "There's a small cabin," he said, his voice still rough, "behind the main house. It has a bed, a stove, water's at the pump. It's yours." She just stared at him. "You're not a prisoner here," he said, feeling clumsy, "and you're not a slave. I don't know what that man told you. I don't know your circumstances. But you're free to go. In the morning, you can take the road east. It leads to the next town in 3 days." He expected relief. He expected tears. He expected something. What he got was a single, sharp question in a voice that was low and clear, with an accent that rounded the edges of the words. "And if I stay?" The question hung in the cool evening air. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Jed thought for a moment. "There's work," he said finally. "I break horses. It's a hard season coming. I pay for work." "I know horses," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, as simple as saying the sky is blue. "All right then," Jed said, nodding. "The cabin is over there. There's food in the main house. Help yourself." He turned and walked toward his own cabin, feeling her eyes on his back. He had offered her a choice, a cage or a bridge. He didn't know which way she would walk. Inside his cabin, the silence was suffocating. It had been his companion for 9 years, but now it felt different. It felt like an absence. He lit the lamp, the yellow light pushing back the gloom. He went to the small wooden chest where he kept his important papers, the deed to the ranch, his discharge papers, Mary's locket, and Silas's last letter. He had read it once, when it arrived a month after the news of Silas's death from cholera down in the border territories. The first page had been simple enough, a rambling account of his latest venture, full of Silas's usual optimism. But then he had turned the page and seen his own name, and he had folded it and put it away. It felt too much like talking to a ghost. Now he had to. He unfolded the brittle pages. Silas's handwriting was a bold, looping scrawl. "Jed, if you're reading this, it means I've cashed in my chips. Don't waste any time grieving, you old goat. We both know this was always a likely outcome. I just hope I went out owing more money than I had, a pretty woman on my arm." Jed smiled faintly. That was Silas. "I'm writing to you about a debt, not one of mine for a change, one of yours. Years ago, when I was trapping south of the Red River, I got myself into a bind, a bad one. A family of the people, the Nde, took me in. They saved my life. The patriarch was a man named Black Heron. He was a man of honor, and he taught me more about horses in 3 months than I'd learned in a lifetime. He had a daughter, a fierce, quiet girl with her father's hands and her mother's eyes. Her name is Inez. I made a promise to Black Heron that if his world ever fell apart, I would see his daughter safe. Well, it fell apart. Sickness, settlers, the government, the usual story. They are scattered. Black Heron is gone. Inez is alone. I've sent word for her. I tried to give her money, but she's got her father's pride. She won't take charity. But she'll take work, and she'll honor a bargain. I was going to set her up with her own small place, but it seems my time has run out. Jed, this is my last ask. Look out for her. She's on her way north with a man I paid to see her to 3 Creeks. He's a weasel named Finch, but he's the only one I could find. He has the mule I bought for her. He's supposed to hand her over to the general store to wait for me. If I'm not there, well, that's where you come in. You owe me, you stubborn bastard. You owe me for pulling you out of that saloon fire in Dodge City. She's proud and she's tough. Tougher than you. But her world is gone. Give her a place to stand. She is a horsebreaker, a real one. Not like us, all muscle and force. She listens to them. And Jed, this is important. There's a second reason you need her, even if you don't know it yet. She knows the value of a thing that holds water. Remember that. Your partner, Silas. Jed folded the letter slowly. A debt. Silas had called in the oldest one they had. The fire in Dodge. Jed had been drunk and stupid, and Silas had dragged his unconscious body out of the flames, getting a long burn scar down his own arm for his trouble. He had never let Jed forget it. He looked out the window. A light had just appeared in the small cabin across the yard, a single steady flame. She was staying. He thought of the cryptic last line, "She knows the value of a thing that holds water." It made no sense. Water was plentiful on his land. The ranch's main value was the year-round creek that cut through it. Silas always did talk in riddles. He put the letter back in the chest and sat down at his small table. The quiet of the house pressed in on him. For the first time in 9 years, he was not entirely alone on his land. He did not know if that was a comfort or a terror. He only knew that a promise had been made, and now he was a part of it. A debt can be a cage, or it can be a bridge. Silas had built the bridge. Now Jedediah and the woman in the cabin had to decide if they were going to walk across it. The first week they did not speak. A routine established itself, born of necessity and caution. He would rise in the dark, make his coffee, and head to the corrals. She would already be there, having risen even earlier, standing by the fence of the large breaking pen, watching the half-dozen wild horses they had to gentle before the snows came. They were mustangs, captured from the high plains, all muscle and fear. Breaking them was hard, dangerous work. He would enter the pen, and she would remain outside, her arms resting on the top rail. He worked the way he always had, with pressure and release, with patience and a firm hand. But he was aware of her watching him, and it made his movements feel clumsy, loud. On the third day, he was working with a fiery sorrel mare who fought the rope at every turn. He was getting frustrated, his patience wearing thin. He felt the familiar urge to force the issue, to make the horse submit. From outside the fence, her voice came, quiet but carrying. She was the lead mare. Jed stopped, the rope held taut in his hands. He turned to look at her. "What?" "The sorrel," Inez said, her gaze on the horse, not him. "In the wild, she was the one who decided where to go, when to run. You are telling her she is no longer the leader. She does not understand your language." Jed stared at the horse. Its ears were pinned, its eyes wide with fury and confusion. He had seen it as just another wild animal to be tamed. She saw its history. He grunted, a non-committal sound, and went back to work. But he changed his approach. He softened his hands, eased the pressure on the rope, and began to move with the mare instead of against her. By the end of the hour, the horse stood, trembling but quiet, and allowed him to touch her neck. He glanced over at the fence, but Inez was gone. The next morning, when he went to the pen, he saw that someone had mended the weak spot in the latch he'd been meaning to fix for a month. The repair was neat, wrapped with stripped leather in a tight, intricate pattern. They ate separately. He would leave a portion of whatever he cooked, stew, beans, bacon, on a plate by the pump. When he went out later, the plate would be clean, sitting back on the edge of the pump housing. One evening, he came back to find the plate, and next to it, a small bundle of wild greens he hadn't known were edible, tied with a blade of grass. He added them to the stew. They were bitter and good. By the second week, she had begun to work. She didn't ask. One morning, he came out to find she had already fed and watered all the stock. The next day, she took one of the unbroken horses, a skittish buckskin gelding, into the smaller round pen. Jed watched from the barn, pretending to be mending tack. She did not use a rope at first. She simply stood in the center of the pen and let the horse run. She watched its every move, the flick of an ear, the shift of its weight, the tension in its hindquarters. She seemed to be having a silent conversation with it. After a long while, she began to move, not toward the horse, but mirroring it, her steps light and rhythmic. It was like a dance. Slowly, slowly, the horse's panicked circles grew smaller. Its head lowered. It turned one ear toward her, then the other. It stopped running and stood, watching her. Only then did she pick up the rope. By noon, she was stroking the buckskin's neck. He had never seen a horse gentled so quickly or so quietly. That evening, he left 2 plates by the pump. He took his own and sat on the steps of his cabin. A few minutes later, she emerged from her own cabin, picked up her plate, and sat on the ground by the corral fence, a good 20 yards away. They ate in the gathering twilight, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the soft nickering of the horses. It was the closest they had come to sharing a meal. The work became the language between them. The days were measured in horses. By the end of the 4th week, they had gentled 4 of the 6 mustangs. She had done 2, and he had done 2. But he knew, with a certainty that humbled him, that her 2 were more truly gentled. His horses obeyed, hers trusted. One afternoon, he was struggling to replace a shoe on the sorrel mare. The horse was antsy, pulling its foot away every time he tried to nail the shoe in place. He was losing his light and his temper. Inez appeared at his elbow, silent as a shadow. She held out her hand. "Let me." He hesitated, then handed her the hammer and nails. He held the horse's leg, his big hands cradling the hoof. She knelt in the dust. She didn't start hammering right away. She spoke to the mare in a low, crooning language he didn't understand. It wasn't Spanish, it was something older, softer. She ran her hand up the mare's leg, a firm, reassuring touch. Then, with swift, economical movements, she set the nails and drove them home. Tap, tap, tap. The mare never moved. When she was done, she stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. She looked at his hands, still holding the horse's hoof. "You are careful," she said. "Most men like you are hard. You are careful." It was the first personal thing she had ever said to him. He didn't know what to reply, so he just nodded and released the horse's foot. She looked at him for a moment longer, her dark eyes searching his face, then turned and walked back to her cabin. He stood there in the fading light, the hammer she had used still warm in his own hand. "Most men like you are hard. You are careful." She saw the distinction. After 9 years of solitude, he had begun to think of himself as a rock, a thing worn smooth by weather, but fundamentally unchanging. She had looked at him and seen the fault lines. She had seen the man he was before the grief, the man who had chosen this land for its beauty, not its isolation. That night, something shifted. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a guarded, wary thing. It was becoming companionable, a shared space that didn't need to be filled with words. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, the quiet closing of her cabin door. The ranch, which had been a fortress to keep the world out, was starting to feel like a home again. He remembered Mary, how she used to say the whole valley was a bowl that held the light. He thought of Silas's letter, "She knows the value of a thing that holds water." He still didn't understand it, but he was beginning to feel its truth. The emptiness inside him, the hollow space he had filled with work, was starting to feel less empty. It was a terrifying feeling. It felt like hope. The change was gradual, a series of small moments that accreted over time, like sediment settling at the bottom of a still pond. One evening, as he sat on his porch cleaning a rifle, she came and sat on the steps of her own cabin, a piece of leather and an awl in her hands. She was mending a bridle, her fingers swift and sure. They sat like that for an hour, separated by 30 yards of dusty ground, but united by the shared rhythm of their work and the quiet of the evening. A few days later, a cold snap descended from the mountains, bringing an early taste of the winter to come. He built a fire in his hearth and found himself staring into it, the loneliness a sudden, sharp ache. On impulse, he walked to her cabin and knocked. It was the first time he had ever approached her door. She opened it, her face framed by the warm lamplight. She looked surprised, but not alarmed. "It's cold," he said, the words feeling foolishly inadequate. "There's a fire in the main house, if you want." She looked past him at his cabin, then back at him. She gave a small, single nod. She closed her door and followed him across the yard. Inside, she did not sit in the chair he gestured to, but went to the hearth, sinking to the floor and holding her hands out to the flames. He took the chair opposite. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a shared quiet, woven with the crackle of the fire. "My father," she said, her voice soft, her eyes on the flames. "He said a fire is a story. You can see the whole life of the wood in it. The sunny side, the side that held the snow." Jed looked at the burning logs. He had never thought of it that way. To him, it was just fuel. "My wife, Mary, she liked the fire." The words came out before he could stop them, the first time he had spoken her name to another living soul in years. Inez did not reply immediately. She simply absorbed the information, letting it settle into the quiet between them. "The dead are not gone," she said after a while. "They are just on the other side of the hill. They can see further than we can." It was a strange comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. He thought of Silas. They can see further than we can. Maybe Silas had seen this quiet room, this shared fire. She pointed to a long, thin scar on his forearm, visible in the firelight. "A rope burn?" He nodded. "A long time ago. A stupid mistake." She held up her own hand. On the palm, near the thumb, was a silvery crescent-shaped scar, almost identical in its faded whiteness. "A branding iron. I was a child. I wanted to help." They looked at each other, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They were both marked, both survivors of a past that had left its brand on them. In that moment, he felt a kinship with her that went deeper than work, deeper than the debt he owed Silas. They were two solitary people who had learned to live with their scars, and now, for the first time, they were not entirely alone with them. The next day, the rhythm was broken. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It was young Tom, a hand from the livery stable in 3 Creeks. He was a good kid, and he'd always had a soft spot for Jed, who'd once paid him a silver dollar for helping him track a lost foal. Tom's horse was lathered, and the boy's face was pale with urgency. He practically fell out of the saddle. "Mr. Stone!" he gasped, holding a stitch in his side. "I had to come. I had to warn you." Jed gave him a cup of water from the canteen on his saddle. Inez had come out of the barn and stood by the corral, watching, her face unreadable. "Warn me about what, Tom?" "It's a man, a Mr. Croft, Harlan Croft." Tom spat the name out like it was poison. "He's in town, staying at the hotel, buying drinks for everyone. He's got papers, Mr. Stone, legal papers." Jed's blood went cold. He knew the name. Croft was a land speculator from back east, a man who bought up deeds and water rights, a man who used the law like a club. "What kind of papers?" Jed asked, his voice low. "He's saying your old partner, Mr. Silas, owed him a fortune," Tom said, his words tumbling out. "Something about a failed mining venture. He's got a note, signed by Mr. Silas, with this ranch put up as collateral. He was in the saloon, bragging, said he was coming out here in a day or two to claim his property. He's got Sheriff Brody with him and two hard-looking men I've never seen before. Jed's mind raced. Silas had always been a gambler, a man of big schemes and bigger risks. It was possible. But to risk the one place Jed had ever called home? It didn't feel right. Still, a signed note was a signed note. Croft wouldn't have come all this way without something that looked official. He said, Tom lowered his voice, glancing nervously at Inez. He said he was looking forward to seeing the improvements you'd made to the place. He laughed when he said it. It was a mean laugh. Jed understood. Croft knew about Inez. Her public humiliation at the auction was town gossip. Croft wasn't just coming for the land. He was coming for the satisfaction of taking everything from the quiet man who lived on the mountain. He was coming to prove his power. "Thank you, Tom," Jed said, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing. Rest your horse, then ride back. But take the long way. I don't want him seeing you coming from here." The boy nodded, his eyes wide. Jed gave him a piece of jerky and another silver dollar, which Tom tried to refuse. "Go on," Jed said, "for the horse." After Tom had gone, a new kind of silence fell over the ranch. The companionable quiet was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting stillness. The threat was no longer a vague possibility of winter or a wild horse. It had a name and a face. Harlan Croft. Inez walked over to him. She had heard everything. "This Croft," she said, "he is a man who buys what is not for sale." Jed nodded. "That's the size of it." "And the lawman is with him?" "It seems so." She looked out at the long road that led to the ranch, a pale ribbon winding through the sagebrush. Then she looked at him. Her face was grim, but there was no fear in her eyes. There was only resolve. "The Inde have a saying," she said. "You do not ask the wolf to leave the sheepfold. You drive it out." She turned and walked, not to her cabin, but to the barn. A minute later, she came out carrying the old, heavy rifle that had been leaning in the corner, forgotten since she arrived. She didn't point it, she just held it, its stock resting on the ground, her hand on the barrel. It was a statement. This was her ground now, too, and she would not give it up without a fight. They had 2 days. 2 days before the wolf would arrive at their door. The work on the horses stopped. A different kind of work began. Jedediah didn't board up his windows or build barricades. That was not his way. His fight would not be with bullets, not if he could help it. It would be with the quiet, stubborn fact of his presence. He had been on this land for 10 years. His roots were deep. Croft was a weed, powerful but shallow. He spent the first day going through his papers, spreading them out on the table. The deed to the ranch was ironclad, in his name and his alone. Mary's name had been on it once, but after her death, the town clerk had helped him file the paperwork, making him sole owner. He found the letter from Silas again and read it over and over. "You owe me, you stubborn bastard." Silas had never mentioned a debt to a man like Croft. It felt wrong. A lie spun out of half-truths, a legal fiction designed to steal what could not be bought. Inez did not ask what he was doing. She seemed to understand that his battle was with paper and ink, while hers was with steel and wood. She spent the day cleaning the old rifle. She stripped it down on a blanket in the sun, her movements precise and economical. She oiled the moving parts until they slid together with a satisfying, metallic whisper. She cleaned the barrel until it gleamed. She checked the ammunition he had in a locked box, counting the cartridges, laying them out in neat rows. She was not preparing for a war, he realized. She was preparing for a possibility. She was refusing to be a victim. Again. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun went down, the cleaned rifle leaning against the wall between them. The air was crisp with the coming autumn. "When I was a girl," she said without preamble, "soldiers came. They had papers too. They said the papers meant the land was no longer ours. My father said the paper was a lie because the land itself did not agree." Jed looked out at his land. The eastern ridge was turning that familiar shade of bruised purple. The creek murmured its constant song. The land did not agree. "Your father was a wise man," Jed said. "He was a dead man a year later," she replied, not with bitterness, but with a flat, final certainty. "Wisdom is not a shield." The words hung in the air. He had been relying on his rightness, on the truth of his claim to the land. She was reminding him that the world did not always bow to the truth. Sometimes it bowed to the man with the most guns, or the most convincing lie. On the morning of the third day, they came. 4 riders cresting the rise. Jed saw them from the barn. Harlan Croft was in the lead, a stout, florid man in a city suit that looked ridiculous on horseback. To his right rode Sheriff Brody, a man Jed had known for years, a man who now refused to meet his gaze. Behind them were 2 men whose faces were hard and empty, hired muscle with pistols strapped to their thighs. Jed walked out of the barn and stood on the porch of his cabin. He was unarmed. A moment later, Inez came out of her own cabin and stood on the porch steps a few feet to his left. She held the rifle, its butt resting on the wood planks. She wasn't aiming it, she was just holding it. A silent statement of presence. Croft's party reined in 10 yards from the porch. The hired men's hands rested near their guns. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Stone," Croft said, his voice a commanding bark. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I am Harlan Croft. I believe this property is mine." "You believe wrong," Jed said. His voice was calm, even. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I have a promissory note signed by your late partner Silas Kane for the sum of $5,000, a debt he secured with this very ranch." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "And I have a court order from a federal judge granting me title in lieu of payment." He was good. Jed had to give him that. A note, a court order. He had built his cage of paper, and it was strong. "Silas is dead," Jed said. "Any debt he had died with him." "Debt is not so easily buried," Croft sneered, "especially when collateral is involved. The judge agrees. Sheriff?" Sheriff Brody cleared his throat. "Jed," he began, his voice strained. "The papers look legal. The judge's order is clear. He's ordering you to vacate the property." "And if I don't?" Jed asked, his eyes locked on the sheriff, ignoring Croft. Brody's gaze fell to the rifle in Inez's hands. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Jed. These men—" Croft interrupted, his eyes lingering on Inez with an insolent appraisal. "It seems you've acquired some new assets since you took over, Stone. I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you an hour to collect your personal belongings. And the woman." His smile was a slash in his fleshy face. "You can leave her. I'm sure we can find some work for her around here." A hot white anger flared in Jed's chest, so pure and so intense it almost took his breath away. But he banked it. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed to be cold. He needed to be careful. He took one step forward to the edge of the porch. "This is my land," he said, his voice dropping low, each word a stone. "My deed is filed in the county courthouse. It is clean. Any claim you have is with Silas's estate, not with me. You have no jurisdiction here. Now get off my property." Croft's face purpled. "Insolent squatter! I have the law on my side." "You have a piece of paper that's a lie," Jed said. "And you have a sheriff who's forgotten his oath. That's not the law. That's a land grab." One of the hired guns shifted, his hand dropping to his pistol. Before he could move further, there was a soft click. It was the sound of a hammer being cocked. Everyone froze. Inez hadn't raised the rifle. She hadn't aimed it, but she had cocked the hammer. Her eyes were fixed on the hired man, and her face was a mask of cold fury. The man's hand froze, inches from his gun. The standoff stretched for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. Croft looked from Jed's unyielding face to Inez's ready rifle, to the sheriff's sudden pallor. He was a man who understood risk and reward. The reward was high, but the risk had just become immediate and personal. He forced another laugh, but it was brittle. "Have it your way, Stone, for now. But that court order is real. I'll be back. And when I come back, I'll bring enough men to tear this place down to the dirt. You'll be gone before the first snow. I promise you that." He wheeled his horse around, spraying dust. "Let's go," he barked at his men. The hired guns looked relieved. Sheriff Brody wouldn't look at Jed as he turned his horse and followed. They rode away, 4 riders shrinking into the vast landscape. They were gone. For now. Jed let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Inez. She was uncocking the hammer, her movements as deliberate as before. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, her eyes still on the road where the riders had disappeared. "The wolf has tasted blood," she said. "He will be back." Jed knew she was right. He had won the skirmish, but the war was far from over. Croft had the power of the law, twisted as it was, on his side. A court order was a powerful thing. Jed had his deed, but Croft had a judge. In a fight between a piece of paper and a man with a gun, the man with the gun usually wins. But in a fight between 2 pieces of paper, the one with the better lawyer wins. And Croft could afford the best lawyers money could buy. Jed had one advantage: time. Croft had said he'd be back before the first snow. That gave him weeks, maybe a month. He had to find a way to make his claim to the land so absolute, so unassailable, that even Croft's corrupted law couldn't break it. He spent that night staring into the fire, Silas's letter in his hand. He had fought Croft on the basis of ownership. This is my land. But Croft's claim wasn't really against him. It was against Silas, a debt that had attached itself to the property like a cancer. He had to cut the property free from Silas's ghost. He kept coming back to that strange final line. She knows the value of a thing that holds water. He thought about the ranch. Its most valuable asset wasn't the grass or the timber. It was the creek. The legal description on the deed specifically mentioned the water rights. In this dry country, water was life. Water was wealth. Croft didn't just want the land, he wanted the water. A thing that holds water. A bucket, a barrel, a canteen, a basin, a valley, a life. And then it hit him. It was so simple, so elegant, it was pure Silas. It wasn't a riddle about hydrology, it was a riddle about law. What is a thing that holds water? An argument, a claim, a legal entity. In the eyes of the law, Jedediah Stone was a single man. His household consisted of one person. Silas's debt was a claim against the property, and as the sole owner, he was vulnerable. But what if the household changed? What if the ownership changed? A family, a marriage. Under the territorial laws, a wife had dower rights. A married couple was a distinct legal entity. Property owned by a married man was not the same as property owned by a bachelor. A claim against a dead man's business partner would have a much harder time attaching to the homestead of a family. The ranch wouldn't just be his anymore, it would be theirs, their home. A home was harder to seize than an asset. It was a thing that held water. Silas hadn't just sent him a horsebreaker. He hadn't just sent him a companion in his loneliness. He had sent him the key. The one person who could legally and morally anchor the ranch in a way that would make it untouchable. She knows the value of a thing that holds water. She herself was the thing that held water. Her presence, her partnership, could make his claim watertight. It was a cold, calculated, legal maneuver. But it was also something more. It was a partnership, a real one, a way to formalize what was already happening. They were already a team. They worked together, defended the ranch together. This would just be another piece of paper. But this piece of paper would be a shield, not a sword. He knew it was a tremendous thing to ask. He wasn't offering love or romance. He was offering a contract, a business deal to save their home. He would be binding her to him, to this land. But he would also be giving her something she hadn't had since her father died. A stake. A piece of the world that was legally hers. He waited until the next evening. He found her by the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. "Inez," he said finally, his voice quiet. She turned to him, her face patient in the twilight. "I've been thinking about Croft." "And the law," he began, choosing his words with care. "My claim to this place is strong, but it's solitary. The law sees me as one man, and it's easy for a man like Croft to push one man off his land." He took a breath. "There is a way to make our claims stronger, to join our claims together, to make the ranch a different kind of thing in the eyes of the law. A family homestead." He looked at her, his gaze direct and honest. "I am asking you to be my wife." He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, and he held up a hand to stop her from speaking. I am not asking for the reasons most men ask. I am not offering you my heart, because I don't know if I have one left to give. I am offering you a partnership, a legal arrangement. Your name would go on the deed alongside mine. This ranch would be half yours. No one could take it from you. It would be a home, protected by the law in a way I alone cannot protect it." He looked down at the creek. "Silas wrote in his letter that you knew the value of a thing that holds water. I think this is what he meant. A marriage as a legal container, to protect us, to protect this place." He finally looked back at her. "It's a proposal of business, I suppose, to save the business and the home." She was silent for a long time, her eyes searching his face, looking for the lie, for the trap. She saw none. She saw only a careful, honest man making a desperate, practical offer. "In my custom," she said slowly, "a marriage is a weaving of two lives. It is not a piece of paper." "I know," he said, "and I am not asking you to forget your customs. I am asking you to use the customs of my world to protect us from the worst of it." "And what would you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "As a wife?" "Nothing you are not already giving," Jed answered truthfully. "Your work, your counsel, your courage. I would ask only that you continue to stand beside me as you did yesterday, and I would stand beside you." He paused. "You would be free, your own person. This would be your home, to come and go as you please, but it would be yours, safe." She turned and looked at the ranch, the cabin with its plume of smoke, the corrals, the vast sweep of land under the darkening sky. She had come here as a piece of baggage, a person with no place to stand. He was offering her half of everything he had, not out of pity, not out of passion, but out of respect. He was offering her a partnership of equals. She looked back at him. A small, slow smile touched her lips for the first time. It transformed her face. "You are a strange man, Jedediah Stone," she said. "You buy a woman you do not want, to honor a debt to a dead man. And now you offer her everything you have to protect her from a man you have just met." "It's a practical solution," he said, feeling his cheeks flush. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." She took a step closer to him. "I will be your wife, Jedediah, on two conditions." "Name them." "I will keep my name. I am Inez of the Inde. I will be your wife, but I will not be Mrs. Stone." "Done," he said without hesitation. "And," she said, her eyes glinting with a spark of the fire he'd seen when she faced down Croft's man, "I keep my rifle." Jed's own lips twitched into a smile. "I would be a fool to try and take it from you." "All right then," she said, as if sealing a deal to buy feed. "We have a bargain." A bargain. It was not the stuff of songs or poems, but it was solid. It was real. It was a bridge they had decided to walk across together. The next morning, they rode into Three Creeks. They didn't ride as a man and a woman, but as two partners on a vital piece of business. Jed wore his town shirt, and Inez wore the same plain skirt and shirt she always did, but she had brushed her hair until it shone and braided a string of small blue beads into the end of it. They bypassed the saloon and the general store, places thick with gossip and staring eyes. They went straight to the county courthouse, a small, neat building of clapboard and stone. Inside, it smelled of dry paper and beeswax. The clerk was a man named Abernathy, a small, meticulous man who lived in a world of ledgers and seals. He peered at them over his spectacles. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice dry as dust, "what can I do for you?" "We need a marriage license, Mr. Abernathy," Jed said, placing the fee on the counter. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Jed's determined face to Inez's calm one. He had heard the rumors, of course. The whole town had. He had likely expected Croft to be the next man to file a claim on this ranch, not its owner to be filing for a marriage. "I see," he said, recovering his professional composure. He pulled out a large book and a fresh form. He began to ask the questions, his pen scratching across the paper. "Groom's name?" "Jedediah Stone." "Bride's name?" "Inez," she said, her voice clear and strong. Abernathy paused, his pen hovering. "Just Inez?" "Yes," she said. He looked at Jed. Jed nodded. Abernathy sniffed but wrote it down. He was a man who followed the rules, and the rules did not require a surname if one was not given. He filled out the rest of the form. They signed it. He took out his official seal, breathed on it, and pressed it into the paper with a satisfying thud. "Congratulations," he said, the words sounding foreign in the quiet office. "You are now husband and wife in the eyes of the law of this territory." He then did something unexpected. He pushed a second form across the counter. "This is a homestead declaration. Given your new marital status, you should file it. It registers this property not just as your holding, but as your family's primary residence. It offers certain protections against liens and forced sales. It would be prudent." He looked at Jed meaningfully. Abernathy was a man of paper, but he was also a man of the town. He knew what Croft was, and in his own quiet, bureaucratic way, he was choosing a side. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Jed said, understanding the gift he had just been given. "We'll file it right now." They filled out the second form. Abernathy stamped it, filed it, and gave them a copy. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, husband and wife. A shield of paper, forged in ink and law, was now theirs. As they were mounting their horses, Sheriff Brody came out of his office across the street. He saw them, and for a moment he looked like he was going to cross over. But then he just stopped, took off his hat, and wiped his brow. He looked at the legal papers in Jed's hand, then at Inez, then back at Jed. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and went back inside. The law in Three Creeks had found its spine again. They didn't have to wait long. Croft returned 4 days later. He brought more men this time, 6 of them, hard cases all. They looked like they were ready for a fight. Croft was not smiling. His face was a thundercloud. Jed and Inez met them on the porch again. This time they stood side by side. "I'm done talking, Stone," Croft snarled. "I have a court order. You have an hour. Then my men will remove you, by force if necessary." Jed didn't say a word. He simply held up the 2 pieces of paper they had brought back from town, the marriage license and the stamped homestead declaration. He handed them to Croft. "You're trespassing, Mr. Croft. This is a legally registered family homestead. The law protects it from the kind of debt you're claiming." Croft snatched the papers. He read them, his face growing darker with every line. He read them again. He looked at the official seals, the clerk's signature, the dates. He looked at Jed. He looked at Inez, who stood beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. The cage of paper he had built so carefully had just been rendered useless by a stronger one. His claim was against Silas Kane and his assets, but the ranch was no longer simply Jed Stone's asset. It was the protected homestead of the Stone Inez household, a new legal entity. To press his claim now would require a new lawsuit, a new judge, a fight against a protected class of property that would take years and a fortune, with no guarantee of success. He had been checkmated. He crumpled the papers in his fist. For a second, Jed thought the man might explode with pure rage. But Croft was a businessman above all. He knew a bad investment when he saw one. He had lost. "You're clever, Stone," he spat, the words dripping with venom. "Cleverer than I thought." He threw the crumpled papers on the ground. "This isn't over." But it was, and they both knew it. He turned his horse, his back rigid with fury, and rode away without another word. His hired men, looking confused and a little disappointed, followed him. They watched until the last rider was a speck on the horizon, until the dust settled, until the only sound was the wind and the creek. The wolf was gone. The first snows came late that year. The autumn was long and golden, the days crisp and clear. The work on the ranch continued, but its rhythm had changed. There was an ease to it now, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond survival. They finished breaking the last of the Mustangs, their combined skill making the work feel less like a battle and more like a conversation. They prepared for winter together. They laid in supplies, chopped wood, and mended the last of the fences. Jed taught her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. She taught him the names of the stars in her own language, constellations he had never seen before in the familiar sky. The small cabin across the yard stood empty. One day, Jed found her moving her few belongings, a spare shirt, the leatherworking tools, a small carved bird her father had made, into the main house. She did not ask. She simply put her things in the spare room that had once been Mary's sewing room. It was her house, too. She was claiming her space. The silence in the cabin was no longer an absence, but a presence. It was filled with the small sounds of two people sharing a life. The scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft thud of a book being closed. They still didn't talk much about the past, or about feelings. They talked about the weather, the horses, the price of feed. But the things they didn't say were as important as the things they did. The space between them was filled with a quiet, growing trust. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, they sat by the fire. He was reading a book, and she was repairing a tear in his coat, her stitches small and neat. "Jedediah," she said. He looked up. She rarely used his full name. "The debt you owed Silas," she said, her eyes on her needlework. "For the fire in Dodge City. It is paid now." He thought about that. He had saved her from Finch, protected her from Croft, given her a home. By the world's accounting, the debt was paid in full, and then some. "I suppose it is," he said. "Good," she said, biting off the thread. "Debts are for merchants. This is something else." She was right. The bargain had been fulfilled. The contract was complete. But they were still here, together, in this warm cabin, while the wind howled outside. The arrangement, the practical solution, had quietly, without their noticing, blossomed into something else. Something that didn't have a name. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the flickering firelight. He saw the strength in her hands, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet dignity that was as much a part of her as her own breath. He thought of the 9 years of emptiness, of the life he had called simplification. He had been wrong. It wasn't simple. It was just empty. He thought of the refrain Silas had been so fond of. A debt can be a cage, or it can be a bridge. You just have to know which way to walk. He had thought the debt was his to Silas, a burden to be discharged, but he saw now that Silas, with his dying breath, had been paying a debt to him, a debt of friendship. He hadn't sent Inez to Jed to be saved. He had sent her to Jed to save him. From the quiet, from the grief, from the slow death of a life lived alone. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the crescent-shaped scar. He turned it over and traced the silvery line with his thumb. Then he held up his own hand, showing her the matching scar on his forearm. Matched scars, from a world that had tried to break them both. "Inez," he said, his voice thick. "This ranch, this life, it holds water now." She looked at their hands, then up at his face. Her eyes were soft. She laced her fingers through his. "Yes," she whispered, "it does." Outside, the snow fell, covering the land in a blanket of clean, quiet white. But inside the cabin, the fire was warm, and 2 people who had started as strangers, bound by a dead man's promise and a piece of paper, sat together in the comfortable silence, their hands intertwined. The debt was gone. All that was left was a life. A full life, chosen freely, built on a foundation of mutual respect, and sealed not with a judge's order, but with the simple, quiet truth of 2 hands that fit together perfectly. He had gone to town to buy a mule, and in the end, he had bought back his own soul.